Well, hey there, everybody. It's your boy, Mr. Perry, and today we are talking about the create task rubric rows 2 and 3. So both of these rows are going to be points awarded to you for correctly using at least one list in your program and then using that list to manage complexity. So let's go ahead and get into it. This is row 2, and you'll get 1 point. And what you have to do is you have to have two program code segments, one that shows how the data has been stored in the list, and then one that shows the data in this list being used as a part of the program. So you basically have to show where it's being created and what's put in it, initially, and then you have to show in the program where it's actually being used. You have to identify the name of the variable representing the list being used in this response. So you basically just need to reiterate the name of the list. And then you have to describe what the data contained in the list is representing in the program. So again, to score the point for row 2, you need 2 images of code segments, and then you need 2 brief paragraph responses. And you can read a little bit more about it over here, but basically at the end of the day, you just want to make sure that your list is important and that it does something, kind of central to the ability of your program to run. And then for row 3, you just have to prove that your list that you pictured before successfully manages complexity of the program. And you have to explain how the named selected list manages complexity by explaining why the program could not be written or how it would be written differently without using the list. So this is going to be important information, important language that we're going to embed into our answer here. But again, you can see how the list is being used is pretty important. You want to make sure that it is a list that performs an important role for your program. But basically, row 3 requires just one more detailed paragraph response. You're probably going to spend a little bit more time writing this paragraph than perhaps you are the others. Okay, so we have to remember the main benefits of using lists, especially when we combine lists with loops, because this is all the stuff that we said helps manage complexity. Using lists makes the code easier to read and understand. It adds layers of abstraction because, again, using a recognizable name for the list by calling the list something easily recognizable, you've just got one label being attached to a bunch of different items. So it reduces the number of lines of code and it gives it a recognizable label, so it adds that layer of abstraction. It's easier to scale up the program. If you want to add more items to the list, that makes it a lot easier to do it that way if you want to make the program a little bit more elaborate. It reduces the number of variables that you have to create, and it also reduces the need for really long if, else statements. And in general, lists and loops reduce the number of lines of code. So let's go ahead and have a look at my responses for 3B. So first off, I have to give them 2 code segments. I have to show them where the list is being created. So here's my list cards with all of my symbols, and then I actually have my corresponding list pulled, which initially is at false. And then later on in the program, this is where I'm actually creating the game board for my player and pulling 4 cards at random and placing them in the first row. So here, my list cards is doing something really important. It's providing all of the elements that will make up my first row as well as my second and third row of cards. So it would be impossible for this game to be played if I didn't use this list and then use this fancy little bit of code down here to create a random number, pull that number from the, or check whether or not it is false. And if it is false, append row 1 with the card from that number, and then again, switch false to true. This is what allows it to go through and make sure it hasn't been pulled already. And if it hasn't been pulled already, go ahead and put it in row 1. And of course, that would repeat for row 2 and row 3. Now I need to do my paragraph responses. So for question 3, I literally just have to say the name of my list. The name of my list is cards. For question 4, or for part 4, I have to explain what cards represents in my game. So again, really straightforward. The cards list represents all of the symbols that must be matched in a game of memory. So pretty straightforward. But part 5, this is the part where you have to describe how it manages complexity. And again, I would recommend doing a longer paragraph here and trying to describe at least 2 reasons why the list manages the complexity of your program. And again, making sure that you're embedding the keywords from the prompt. So the cards list manages the complexity of my program because each card is represented by a string. Since this program requires 12 cards, all of those strings can be stored in a list. So I basically just start by the fact that I've got a bunch of different pieces of data in this program that are all strings. And so it makes sense, because they are all the same data type, it makes sense to just store them in a list. Now I'm going to write about what I would have to do if I didn't use a list. If I wrote the code without the list, I would need 12 separate variables to store the value of each card, which means my code would be longer and more complicated. And it's important to include these details right here, because when you're contrasting what your code would look like without using a list, you have to definitely bring up some of the negative impacts that would have on your program code. If I stored them as separate variables as opposed to using a list, I would also need numerous additional nested selection statements when checking which cards the player selected and whether they match. So again, I'm getting into this idea that I would not only have to have a lot of additional variables, I would have to have additional if, elif, and else statements. And then I also bring in another advantage. Another advantage of using a list is that I can easily add more cards to my program for an increased level of challenge by simply adding more strings to my list as opposed to creating additional variables. So like I say, as long as you have a good list in your program, and as long as that list is performing an important action, it shouldn't be too tough to get row 4, the point for row 2, the point for row 2. But the point for row 3 requires a little bit more. You really have to demonstrate that you understand the benefits of using lists, and that you can, contrast why using your lists were an important part of your program, as opposed to what the code would look like without using that list. All right. So hopefully this helps out. Feel free to hop over to the class website and look at other sample programs that the College Board has published, and look at the kind of lists that they use, and definitely look at answer number 5 here, or part 5, where they describe how it manages complexity. This is a good one to make sure that you're looking at several different examples of before you write your own. All right, thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in class.